Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for a daily dose of Innistrad Midnight Hunt Commander spoilers. And oh my god, Wizard spoiled both decks today, every single card. We got about 1 million new cards to talk about. It's going to be a really long video, which means we should probably jump right into it. Start talking sweet new Innistrad Midnight Hunt Commander cards. Before we do, two quick reminders. One, if you want to see the full deck list, we got them up over at mtgpreviews.com. You can sort them, you can filter them, see the prices, all that good stuff, so check that out if you're interested. Number two, if you need to pick up these decks or any cards from Innistrad Midnight Hunt, you can grab the cards from our sponsor, Card Kingdom, by going over to cardkingdom.com/mtggoldfish. Even get a free goldfish sticker. Just let them know you want one, and they'll hook you up. They're super sweet like that. And without further ado, let's talk sweet new Innistrad Midnight Hunt Commander cards. We're kicking things off today with the Selesnya deck, the new cards from the Selesnya deck, headlined by Leonor Autumn Sovereign. And we're not going to get into Leonor again. We actually covered Leonor during our last daily spoiler video. However, it is important to remember that Leonor is the leader of this deck because a lot of the other cards are designed to work with Leonor. We got human tribal sub-themes, +1/+1 counter sub-themes, Coven sub-themes. So even though we're not going to break down Leonor again, click on the card, watch the first spoiler video if you want to see about Leonor. It is important to remember that this is the card that's kind of pushing this entire deck forward. So anyway, let's talk the new cards from the Selesnya deck, starting with the two backup commanders. First up, we got Kyler Sigarden Emissary, and this card, kind of insane as a human commander. 5 mana 2/2 Selesnyan human cleric. Whenever another human enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and then other humans you control get +1/+1 for each counter on Kyler. So Kyler, it grows like Thalia's Lieutenant. We've seen this mechanic with humans before. When a human comes into play, put a counter on it. The thing about Kyler is it's really growing your entire team whenever a human comes into play. When a human comes into play, you get the counter on Kyler, and that counter grows the rest of your team, which is really powerful. Play a bunch of cheap humans, make everything huge, kill your opponent. You can even see a comparison to like Cathar's Crusade, which another 5 mana play that when a creature comes into play, you put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. The big difference is Kyler needs to stay on the battlefield. And I think that's an important thing to realize about Kyler. It's a commander that needs to stay out for 2, 3, 4 turns in a row to really be powerful, because you want it to stay on the battlefield, build up a bunch of counters, make your team huge. So if you do build around Kyler, protecting it from removal, I think, is going to be essential. I think my favorite way to build Kyler is probably going to be human tokens, because remember, Kyler triggers whenever a human enters the battlefield. It doesn't have to be cast necessarily, which means cards like Increasing Devotion, Call the Coppercoats, even Join the Dance. Really insane with Kyler because they're putting multiple humans into play at once. Let's say we have nothing on the battlefield but Kyler, and we cast Increasing Devotion. Makes 5 1/1 humans. Each of those triggers Kyler, makes Kyler into a 7/7 with 5 +1/+1 counters. Those 5 counters are going to grow all of our Increasing Devotion tokens because they're humans, so they're going to be 6/6s. That's a ridiculous amount of power and toughness for 5 mana. So I think Selesnya human tokens is my favorite, best way to build around Kyler. I actually think, though, it's actually just a good generic human commander. Like, maybe you don't want to be on the token sub-theme. Even just playing green-white humans, I think Kyler might be the best option. We got Sigarda, which is fine, but not really exciting. Maja is kind of like a mini Kyler. We got Catilda, but I like that better in the 99. So if you just want to be straight green-white humans, I think Kyler is probably the best commander available to us now. As far as playing it in the 99 other decks, I don't know. Like, there's 5-color human decks with Kenrith or Morophon. Could you run Kyler in those decks? You certainly could. Is it going to be worth it? The biggest problem is not that Kyler's bad. Kyler can be very strong if it sits on the battlefield. The problem is there's so many humans. You might say that the Magic world is overpopulated with humans. We just get so many every set, which means there's a lot of competition for each slot in the deck. And it might be that even though Kyler's a pretty powerful card, when you have every human available in all of Magic in every color, it might just barely not make the cut. So Kyler, love it as a human token Selesnya commander. Also like it a lot as just a Selesnya human commander, even without the token sub-theme, and maybe a bit of potential in the 99 and other human decks, but that's where it gets a little bit more unclear. We also got our last backup commander, Kubrist Harvest Celebrant, a double green and X, 0/0 tree folk that enters the battlefield with a number of counters equal to the number of mana spent to cast it, and then you can remove a counter from it to prevent all damage that would be dealt this turn to another target creature with a +1/+1 counter on it. So Kubris, it's a big X-spell tree folk. It's important to understand how this card works though. The way it's formatted is a little bit wonky, different than most X creatures. The X is not its counters or its power and toughness, it's just there to let you pay more mana into it. It grows based on the amount of mana you spend on it. This is the formatting we've seen with a few cards recently to make them work in Commander. Most notably, Verizal is formatted the same way, and this means two important things. One is you can cast Kubris for 2 mana, double green, and you get a 2/2 because you spent 2 mana on it. So the X isn't necessary. You don't have to spend the X to cast Kubris. The other thing it does is make it work really well with the command tags. In Commander, your commander dies, you got to pay more mana to recast it. Well, with Kubris, the more mana you have to pay to recast it to pay the tax is going to be more counters. So it's going to scale really well even through the command tags throughout the game, which is good because I don't think it's like super powerful as a commander. Preventing damage is nice. We see this ability on like Ors. Removing a counter to prevent damage, it's very good in combat. I think that's its main home, where you're able to attack or block and then remove counters and make it really difficult for your opponent to figure out how to attack in your board, how to block your creatures, because you could always prevent the damage, and it doesn't prevent the damage to your opponent's creatures, just to your creatures. On the other hand, it isn't hard protection. It doesn't stop Wrath, doesn't stop a Doomblade, targeted removal spell, a Path to Exile. So it's mostly good at messing with combat. If you want to play mono green counters, there's some other good options. Vorinclex, probably the most powerful. Mawu also does the counter thing in his own good boy sort of way. I don't think Kubris is that strong. I actually think I probably like it more in the 99 of a counter deck rather than as the commander. Although if you do want to build counters, I mean, mono green's got the support. You got doubling seasons and Colonian Hydras and a million Hydras and branching evolutions. So you certainly can build around Kubris as your commander. Just the damage prevention ability isn't that exciting to me. So I think mostly this would be kind of like a Voltron commander where your goal is just to make it really big, give it trample, just swing in and hit your opponent, because I'm not really sure what you do with the damage prevention ability other than mess with your opponent trying to block your stuff. It does seem really sweet in the 99 of other counter decks like Hamas or Vorinclex, where you can use it to sort of maybe sometimes protect your important creatures, at least in combat. So Kubris, I don't think it's super powerful, but it is a cool card. Cool to see more tree folks, and it is designed in a way to scale well for commander. I'd probably like it better in the 99 than as my commander, but still, cool new card coming in Innistrad Commander. As far as the non-legendary cards in the deck, we got a bunch of them. Let's start with the creatures. First up, Somberwald Beastmaster. 6 mana 1/1 human ranger. When it enters battlefield, make a 2/2 green wolf token, a 3/3 and a 4/4 green beast token, and creature tokens you control have death touch. So Somberwald Beastmaster, first let me say, it really annoys me that it says beast twice. I feel like it should be a different creature type. I don't know why that bothers me so much. I know it shouldn't bother me so much. It just looks weird. I feel like it should have whatever. Choose any other creature type. An antelope, an eye. I don't really care. Just something other than beast twice in a row at 2 different sizes. That part strikes me as weird. That said, Somberwald Beastmaster is a pretty sweet card. It is almost exactly the same as Tristani Summoner. Tristani Summoner, the upside of Tristani Summoner is some of the tokens have abilities like the Rhino as Trample or whatever, and they all have different creature types, which for some reason is important to me that I still don't really understand why. On the other hand, Somberwald Beastmaster giving all your tokens death touch is potentially powerful in the right deck. I will say I'm skeptical of Somberwald Beastmaster being that good for a couple of reasons. One is Tristani Summoner doesn't really see staple level play in any deck. Occasionally shows up in like a big token deck, occasionally shows up in like a Rune Blink style deck, but really it's not a kind of card that you would consider a staple. And while Somberwald Beastmaster I think is an upgrade, and it is in 1 color, which is important, I don't think it's that much of an upgrade. For 7 mana in Commander, there's some powerful things that can just win the game essentially on its own. Somberweld Beastmaster, while it does add 10 power and toughness across 4 bodies to the battlefield, it doesn't actually just win the game. The one place, though, I'm really excited for this card is in Gruul tokens. I was trying to figure out what do you do with Death Touch on Somberweld Beastmaster, and Somberweld Beastmasters as such is an upside. You just give your tokens Death Touch, they're better on defense, they're hard to block, so it's never a bad thing, but the way to really build around the ability, I think, is Gruul tokens. Maybe you're led by Thromix, seems perfect with its Devour ability, or Worse the Hate Seed, but what I really want to be doing is making Devil tokens, because Devil tokens, when they die, they get to ping something. If they have Death Touch, that means they can shoot down any creature on the board with their single ping, which seems really, really powerful. So I think that's the direction I'd want to go with Somberweld Beastmaster. So I don't think that it's quite good enough for like Panharmonicon decks, Ephemerate style decks. You could play it there, but I don't think it's like one of the 100 best cards that you can play in an archetype like that. It is fun, and it is cool that for 1 mana with Ephemerate, you're going to make 9 more power because you get all those tokens again, or double it up with Panharmonicon. So it is fun, I just don't think it's quite that powerful, but in Gruul tokens, it seems really insane thanks to the Death Touch ability. We also got Stalwart Pathlighter, so a 3 mana, 3/1 human soldier with vigilance. It has Coven, beginning a combat on your turn. If you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn. So this is very similar to like Frontline Medic. When you attack with it into other creatures, creatures get indestructible this turn. Squad Commander, if you have party, gives yourself +1/+0 and indestructible until end of turn. So we've seen many things that do this. Stalwart Pathlighter, basically the Coven version of this, and I feel like this is a card that probably won't see play in most decks. Like Frontline Medic, I would argue is probably a slightly better version of it. I think Battalion, only attacking with 2 other creatures, probably easier than hitting Coven by a bit. It also has more toughness, but there are homes for this, especially in attacking decks. If your goal is to keep attacking and attacking, and you want to be triggering Mentors and Melees and Winotas, making all your team indestructible actually has a decent amount of value in a deck like that. You can swing with all your stuff to get Winota triggers. Sure, maybe your opponent has good blocks, but what do you care? Your stuff's indestructible anyway, and I think that's the home for Stalwart Pathlighter in decks that really, really care about being able to swing every single turn because they're getting value out of attacking. In a normal deck, even a normal like human aggro deck, I just am not sure the effect is worth it, because if your attacks are bad, you're not going to get through damage anyway. That's basically the problem. Like, sure, you got a bunch of 1/1s and you can swing with them and they're not going to die, but it doesn't actually matter because your opponent can just block them. So making a bad attack doesn't actually progress the game in a meaningful way. It also only triggers on your turn, so you can't use it on defense. So I feel like in an attacking centric deck, Stalwart Pathlighter couldn't be in the conversation. Otherwise, probably not quite good enough. We also got, perhaps one of the most powerful cards in this entire deck, Heron Blade Elite, 3 mana 1/1 human warrior with vigilance. When another human enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on it, tap it, add X mana of any one color where X is its power. So you might be thinking, this card feels familiar to me, and that's because it's essentially Marwyn the Nurturer. It is actually exactly Marwyn, but upgraded. It's in the human tribe now. It has vigilance now. It adds mana of any one color rather than just green mana. Marwyn is a pretty popular elf card. Like, it's a good elf ball commander, even a CDH elf commander, because of its combo potential, being able to untap it a bunch of times and just make ridiculous amounts of mana and win the game. Heron Blade Elite essentially does the same thing for the human tribe, which is absurd. Like, I feel like this is just an ultra staple in human tribal. If you're playing human tribal and you're in Heron Blade's Elite colors, you play this card because it's really, really busted. And this card, I actually, in a weird way, kind of dislike it. Even though it's incredibly powerful and I can't wait to play it, we've seen humans in the past get a lot of mana dorks. They get Noble Hierarchs and Avacyn Pilgrims, these 1 or 2 mana things that add a mana. What Heron Blade Elite is, though, is very different. This is a card that adds a ton of mana. It's an elf card. It's literally Marwyn, but a human. And because humans are so prevalent and we get so many of them, I'm really not sure I like it kind of honing in on another tribe's thing, like stealing the elfin way of making mana. We kind of saw this with Catilda too, doing what Gemhide Sliver does, but for humans, another new Innistrad Midnight Hunt card. So I worry a little bit because humans have good removal and they have good threats, and now they also have insane big time mana production. if humans does everything, why do you play elves, which doesn't have the best threats and doesn't have all the other stuff human has, but does make a lot of mana that's like elves gimmick? If your humans make mana like elves and they do all these things that elves don't do, what's the point of elves anymore? So I'm a little worried about humans in general just being too good, with this big mana production being kind of a new twist that we haven't seen in the tribe before. But that said, Heronblade Elite, it's a really strong card, and if you're playing humans and you have green in your color identity, it should be in your deck every single time because it is really, really good. We also got Sigarda's Vanguard, a new angel, 5-mana 3/3, angel with flash and flying. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, choose any number of creatures with different powers. Those creatures gain double strike until end of turn. So Sigarda's Vanguard, kind of a pseudo Coven card. It doesn't actually have Coven, but it does care about creatures with different powers. It is hard to figure out how good this card is. If you have a board full of creatures that are all the same power, is a 5-mana 3/3 that gives a creature double strike actually that good, even if it does it again when it attacks? I don't know. On the other hand, if you have a big board full of different powered creatures, this is essentially a discounted flash version of Terra Mount Velis or Goring Ceratops, giving your whole team, most of your team, double strike by surprise at instant speed is actually a really powerful effect. So I think how good this card is going to depend on how many different powers you can get on the battlefield. Can see an argument that the flash makes it a little bit Flying Crane technique-ish, or like a really, really budget, watered down, not really the same, but if you squint really hard, kind of a small part of a Chrome as well. So this is a tricky card to evaluate because it's going to be so contextual based on your deck. We've seen like Kaya's Onslaught. 3 mana gives a creature +1/+1 in double strike until end of turn. That is the baseline. 3 mana for 1 creature. Sigarda's Vanguard, 5 mana, you get a 3/3 body. It's still instant speed, and it could potentially hit multiple creatures. I think that's potentially powerful if you can be hitting multiple creatures with it. The other place that this could maybe have a role, and I'm not 100% sure, but maybe in Voltron decks like Killin or Zurgo or Daxos, if your goal is to make a big evasive commander and just smash your opponent to death with it, giving that big evasive commander double strike seems pretty good. And the upside of Sigarda's Vanguard is it gets it once with the ETB, and then it'll do it again on the next combat. So you're getting this repeatedly again and again and again, which seems really scary. You kill one person, kill the next person, go around the table. So while Sigarda Vanguard is going to be at its best in a deck with a big board of creatures with a bunch of different powers, it might be good enough to show up in dedicated Voltron decks as well. We also got Moorland Rescuer, and this is a pretty interesting card. 6 mana 4/4 Human Knight. When it dies, return any number of other creatures with total power X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, where X is Moorland Rescuer's power, then exile Moorland Rescuer. So there's a lot to break down here. On level 1, you spend 6 mana, you get a 4/4. Your board gets Wrath. You get back up to 4 power worth of creatures across any number of bodies. However, there's some shenanigans here. I think the easiest comparison is like a watered down Nethroi. Nethroi, when it mutates, lets you get back up to 10 total power of creatures. Moorland Rescuer, gonna take some work to get 10 total power, although it's nice that you don't have to deal with mutating. The first thing to realize about this card is the way it's actually worded. There is a way to avoid exiling your Moorland Rescuer. If you look at something like Arena Rector, it says when it dies, you may exile it. If you do, you tutor up a Planeswalker and put it on the battlefield. So it dies, you have a choice, exile or no. If you choose yes, then it goes to exile, you get the ability. If you choose no, then, well, nothing happens. Moorland Rescuer is not worded that way. When it dies, you're going to get a trigger to reanimate a bunch of stuff and then exile your Moorland Rescuer. This means there's a window with this trigger on this stack to do shenanigans. The easiest shenanigan is just put it back to your hand or instant speed reanimate it to the battlefield. Let's say you have Naya Charm, which lets you return a card from your graveyard to your hand at instant speed. You can Moorland Rescuer, get its reanimation trigger, bounce it back to your hand, still reanimate stuff with it. So that's one easy shenanigan. This also opens up combo potential. Let's say you got Safi Eric's-Daughter. You can sack Safi to make it so when target creatures put into your graveyard from play this turn, return it to play, and then you maybe have a sack outlet like Altar of Dementia. So the idea would be you sack Safi, target targeting your Moorland Rescuer. Then you Altar of Dementia to sack the Moorland Rescuer. Moorland Rescuer goes to the graveyard. You get its reanimation trigger, which will get back Sappy and maybe another creature or two if you got some low power creatures. And if you stack your triggers right, you can get the Sappy return trigger to resolve before the Exile Moorland Rescuer trigger to resolve. So then you can do it again and again and again, and infinite death triggers and reanimate a whole bunch of stuff and win the game with Altar of Dementia or whatever. So that's one easy shenanigan. I think you can also do shenanigans with Joffrey in a very similar but very weird way. Joffrey, when a non-token creature you control dies, you exile it. Then you get a token copy of it that's a spirit, and when that token dies, you put the original card back into your graveyard from exile. So if I'm understanding this right, and maybe I'm missing something here, let me know in the comments if I'm wrong on this one, but I think what you should be able to do is sacrifice your Moorland Rescuer to a whatever, Altar of Dementia, Blasting Station, make it so Joffrey exiles it rather than Moorland Rescuer exiles it. Also reanimate a few things. Then you can sack the Moorland Rescuer token. That token is going to put the original Moorland Rescuer back into play, and when it goes to the graveyard, you get to reanimate up to 4 power of creatures, which will be the original Moorland Rescuer. So then you get back the original, then you go through that loop again, reanimate a bunch of stuff along the way, and eventually win the game with your infinite sacrifice, Altar of Dementia mills, however you want to do it. So I think that that should work as well. But those are the really in-depth, crazy combo ways to play Moorland Rescuer. It's just a fine standalone card. Like, it seems good for humans, because the thing about humans is they're good at growing other humans. We've seen that with Kyler and Thalia's Lieutenant, and the more you boost Moorland Rescuer's power, the more you're going to be able to get back from your graveyard when it dies. The other thing that's nice about playing with humans is a lot of them are small, and then they grow throughout the game. Like Champion of the Parish, a lot of times it ends up a 10-10. Same with Thalia's Lieutenant. It's a 10-10, but really it's a 1-1. So these small creatures are going to be tiny in the graveyard and easy to reanimate, but still get huge on the battlefield. So Human Tribal seems like a reasonable place, even if 6 mana is kind of a lot. The other place that I love this card, maybe my favorite place for Moorland Rescuer, is in Toughness Matter decks, like Arcades or Doran. These are decks that usually play a bunch of 0-powered creatures, because they're dealing damage equal to their toughness anyway, so you want high toughness, low power. In those decks, Moorland Rescuer can get back a ton of creatures from the graveyard. Like, you can reanimate literally an infinite number of 0-power creatures. So if you're playing Arcades Walls, and all your creatures, or most of them, are 0 power, a single Moorland Rescuer could easily be getting back 10, 20 creatures, just rebuilding your entire board. So keep that in mind. 0-power creatures, you can get back as many as you want. So Moorland Rescuer might be the most interesting card that we've talked about so far. Combo potential, wall potential, human tribal potential. 6 mana does mean it's a little bit sketchy to play fairly, might be a little bit too much, but certainly an interesting, unique, and powerful effect. Speaking of Arcades and Defender decks, we also got Wall of Mourning, 2 mana 0/4 wall, Defender. When it enters the battlefield, exile a card from the top of your library for each opponent you have. So in Commander, normally going to be exiling 3 cards, and then Coven at the beginning of your end step. If you have 3 or more creatures with different powers, put an exiled card, a card exiled with Wall of Mourning, into its owner's hand. So essentially, Wall of Mourning is Wall of Omens with extra steps, but also extra upside. So Wall of Omens just draws you a card. Wall of Mourning doesn't necessarily draw you a card. If you have Coven, it'll draw you a card on your end step. The upside is it can potentially draw you a card the next turn as well, and the turn after that. So you get 3 cards exiled if you have 3 opponents immediately. So that's 3 extra cards you can potentially draw with this over the course of 3 turns. And then if you reset it with blinking or something like that, you could potentially do it again. I think Wall of Mourning, a staple for Arcades decks, Parmacon decks, basically things that care about Defender, things that care about walls. I think it's actually a really powerful option as a card advantage generating 2-drop wall, similar to Wall of Omens with a bit of a twist. I would say Wall of Omens, it's certainly more consistent. I don't know what's better in a game of Commander. I think that's where it gets a little bit questionable. I think Wall of Mourning could actually be better, because who's going to try to kill your Wall of Mourning? Probably no one. So it probably is going to sit out, and eventually you're going to get the cards, but there is a bit of delayed gratification where you might not get the cards right away. So interesting new option for Wall and Defender Matter style decks. We also got Sigarden Zealot, a new human cleric, a green human cleric, 5 mana 3/3. At the beginning Beginning combat on your turn, choose any number of target creatures with different powers, back to the different powers Coven thing. Each of them gets +X and gains vigilance until end of turn, where X is Sigardan Zealot's power. So Sigardan Zealot, again, power going to be dependent on how many different powers of creatures you can have on the battlefield, although really, I don't think this is a very good card. Something like Pathbreaker Ibex is kind of similar. One more mana, it's got to attack, but it's just going to give your team +X, where X is its power, and trample. That is the big deal. Sigardan Zealot can potentially make your things really, really big, but it doesn't give them evasion. Vigilance is nice, I guess, but it's not going to help you get through combat damage. So costing 5 mana, I feel like in the decks that could play this, I'd rather just have a Ibex, an Overrun, something like that. Something that gives me trample to get in damage. Sure, with Kyler or with Leonor, putting counters on it or growing your team, this can be giving your team a lot of power and toughness, but that doesn't matter if your opponent can just jump block it. So I would lean towards this card probably not being good outside of the precon itself. I think there's just the Overrun costs that amount of mana. At 5 mana, you should be able to give your team +3/+3 and trample, rather than give some of your team +3/+3 and vigilance, with the upside that maybe you can grow your Sigardan Zealot and give more than +3/+3, but I just don't think it's actually good enough for most decks. We also got, moving from creatures into spells, Ruinous Intrusion. 4 mana instant, exile an artifact or enchantment, put X+1/+1 counters on target creature you control, where X is the mana value of the permanent exiled this way. This calls back to artifact mutation or a mutation that blow up artifacts and enchantments, but instead of giving you a bunch of tokens based on mana value, like these old versions, Ruinous Intrusion goes tall. It gives you a bunch of counters on one creature. 4 mana is a lot. That's my biggest concern. Exiling an artifact or enchantment at instant speed for 4 mana, that's pretty expensive. Once you get to 4 mana, you got cards that can easily exile 2 artifacts and enchantments, and some of them, like Sylvan Reclamation, can basic land cycle, so it's a lot of mana to get a single artifact or enchantment, which makes me think I wouldn't play this in most decks. I think if I just need to kill artifacts or enchantments, there is either cheaper or more flexible Beast Within style removal that I could be playing. However, I still think this card has a role. It can put a lot of counters on your team. The dream is you hit a Great Henge or something, and you put 9 +1/+1 counters on a creature, or Chromatic Ori, get 7 counters, although the floor is something like a Signet probably, or a Soul Ring, where you're getting a couple of counters, and that makes it less good. So Ruinous Intrusion, I think the upside is there. Imagine like attacking with your creature, instant speed, get your Great Henge, 9 counters, kill you, or like blow you out after you blocked in combat. So there is cool shenanigans with this card, but I think you really got to be a +1/+1 counter deck to make it worth it. I think if you are just playing random stuff, just getting some counters, whatever, that's not that important. But if you are Vorinclexing and doubling the counters, or turning the counters into ramp with Hamza and so forth, then I think that Ruinous Intrusion is good enough to be in your deck. So a new removal spell for +1/+1 counter decks. Only other thing I want to mention about this card is the way it's worded. You do have to control a creature. When you cast this, you got to target an artifact or enchantment and a creature you control. So if you somehow don't have a creature, you literally cannot cast this spell, which that's not really a huge problem. You should have a creature. It's pretty unlikely, but keep that in mind. There could be a scenario where like your board gets wrath and you want to kill a Mirari's Wake or something, and you don't have a creature, so you can't actually do it. So small downside, but not a deal breaker by any means. We also got a new green curse, Curse of the Clinging Web. So 3 mana, you enchant a player. When a non-token creature enchanted player controls dies, exile it, and you get a 2/2 green spider creature token with reach. So this reminds me a bit of Kalitas. Kalitas, kind of the same ability, but it hits all opponents and you get 2/2s plus, it's a creature and lifelink and all that kind of stuff. So this could be a kind of interesting hate card, Kalitas style. Although we've seen this text on a lot of cards in Zendikar, and I don't know if it's worth playing a curse just for that. So how do you actually play this card? One possibility is you just hold it in hand. Maybe you're playing a spider deck. I think that would be a possible home if you can take advantage of the creature type of the tokens that you're making. But you hold it in hand, and then when you get ready to wrath, you put it on whoever has the most creatures, and then you Damnation or Toxic Deluge and make a bunch of spiders, and you're happy with it. So I think that's one way to play it. As far as having it be graveyard hate, it's not actually the best graveyard hate. Like, Curse of Clinging Webs doesn't stop your opponent from going Entomb, reanimate something big, and kill you. What it is really good hate for is death trigger stuff. Aristocrat hate. If your opponent's playing Tisa Karlov, trying to double up their death triggers, or Alenda, trying to make a ton of tokens, Curse of Clinging Web shuts that down because it creates a replacement effect where if a creature would die, instead it gets exiled and you get a token, that means you're not going to allow your opponent to do Aristocrat shenanigans. Their Blood Artists and Cruel Celebrants and Zulaport Cutthroats are not actually going to trigger. So I think that is the main thing that you want to target with Curse of Clinging Webs. Against a dedicated Reanimator deck, it could be okay, but it only gets things dying, things leaving the battlefield and going to the graveyard, not things going into the graveyard in other ways, like Entombs or Buried Alives or Satyr Wayfinders or whatever. So Curse of Clinging Webs, outside of Spider Tribal shenanigans, I think its main home is going to be Curse Tribal. I don't think it quite does enough to just play it in a random green deck. Maybe if you got like a friend in your playgroup that's always playing Aristocrats, you could bring it in just to like get them. But I think Curse Tribal is probably where it's going to shine. You can tutor it up with Curse of Misfortunes, and we're getting more curses that care about the amount of curses you have on the battlefield. Curse of Surveillance, we got Curse of Thirst. So Curse of Clinging Webs is just another way to power up your other stuff and a reasonable thing to target the Aristocrat player with. I guess technically you could target yourself in some sort of sacrifice deck, but it's hard for me to see how it's going to be worth it to exile all your creatures unless you have some crazy build that I haven't thought of yet. So interesting new curse, good Aristocrat hate, and good for the curse deck at a minimum. We also got a new ramp spell, which I think is a trap. Celebrate the Harvest. 4-mana sorcery. Search your library for up to X basic lands, where X is the number of different powers among creatures you control, and then put those cards onto the battlefield tapped and shuffled. So if we think about this card, it compares to like Explosive Vegetation, Migration's Path, Vastwood Search, 4-mana ramp spell. So the baseline for this card to be functional is 2 lands. And even that's a little sketchy. Explosive Vegetation and these 4-mana ramp spells have fallen out of favor in a lot of decks. But to even consider this as an early game ramp spell, we got to be getting 2 lands, which I just don't think is practical. You want to be casting your Explosive Vegetation effect by turn 4, ideally even earlier with the helper ramp, which means you would have to somehow like play a creature turn 1, play a creature turn 2, both have different power, and then try to cast your Explosive Vegetation and try to cast your Celebrate the Harvest, and that's only giving you an Explosive Vegetation. For it to be better than Explosive Vegetation, you need 3 creatures with different powers. You need Coven, essentially. So you need to have Coven to make it better than an Explosive Vegetation. And remember, Explosive Vegetation isn't even that good. So I actually think that you should not consider this card as a ramp spell in your deck. And you're going to trick yourself into it. You're going to think, oh, I got a lot of creatures with different powers. My deck can make this work. No one else can, but my deck is the one that can actually do it. Let me tell you, that's probably not a good idea. When you think about how a commander game plays, you want to spend your early turns setting things up. You want to be playing mana rocks, setting things up for the later turns, not trying to play creatures with different powers to turn on Celebrate the Harvest when you could just cast an Explosive Vegetation. But that does not mean this card is bad. You just got to think of it differently. This is a combo piece. That's how I'm viewing Celebrate the Harvest. I think this is a card similar to Boundless Realms, another card that can put a ton of lands into play, but is not really an early game ramp spell that's helping you set up. It's more of a combo piece. I think that Celebrate the Harvest, you play it with landfall style decks, with Phallus or Omnath, things like that, where in the mid to late game, hopefully you have 5 creatures or 7 creatures with different powers, and you cast this and get a ton of lands and get a ton of landfall triggers and win the game. So Celebrate the Harvest, it's a good card, but the way to use it, I think, is as a combo piece, not as an early game set things up ramp spell, because I think it's gonna be disappointing. Even if you think your deck can support it, it probably can't actually support it. So I think it's going to be disappointing as an early game ramp spell, but a sweet landfall style combo piece. We also got one more curse in the deck, Curse of Conformity. 5 mana, enchant a player, non-legendary creatures, enchanted player controls, have base power toughness of 3/3 and lose all creature types. And this is a really interesting curse to me because it's one of those curses that you might want to use on yourself sometimes. I think this is a curse that you put in your deck because there's some chance you want to use it on yourself, but then you might use it on your opponents as well. So its ability, kind of like Harmonious Archon, except it doesn't add any power and only targets one player, but it basically turns all of one player's things into 3/3s, also non-legendary. That's a bit of a drawback. There are a lot of legends these days, so not hitting legends, that exclusion, might actually be a problem. Worth mentioning, it doesn't make the creatures lose their abilities. This is not a Oko or a Kenris transformation. It just makes them lose creature types, so much less powerful than losing abilities, although losing creature types can still have value. If you run into a tribal deck and you're playing goblins, or you're playing zombies, or you're playing elves, targeting the tribal player is actually going to be a legit line. Like, your Elvish Archdruid not going to tap for a lot of mana because, well, you don't have any elves on the battlefield, so it's not going to make a bunch of mana. So I think that is one use of Curse of Conformity. However, if you just want to hate on a tribal deck, I kind of feel like a Wrath is probably just better. Just vanquish the horde away their board rather than giving them 3/3s, because remember, sure, your Elvish Archdruid might not tap for a ton of mana, but you could also be growing your opponent's creatures. Like, all of your Llanowar elves are suddenly going to be 3/3s, so you could be actually adding power to your opponent's battlefield. On the other hand, I could see an argument for using this on myself to turn, especially tokens, into 3/3s. Like, all of a sudden, Lingering Souls is making 12 power, increasing devotion, adding 15 power. Your Avenger of Zendikar 0/1 plants are going to be 3/3s. So I think that is the way you play this card. You play it in some sort of token deck with the thought being, okay, maybe like 50% of the time, I'm going to put this on myself as like a weird anthem to grow my team. And then if I happen to be in a pod where I'm up against a tribal deck, then sticking on the tribal player to slow them down is a legitimate use. The other, like, galaxy brain way to play this card is with Winota. If you go really deep, you can make losing all creature types on your creatures in upside. Winota, when you attack with a non-human, digs through your library to put humans into play. Well, Curse of Conformity only impacts the battlefield. It doesn't change the creature type of stuff in your deck. So if you have Winota in this, all your creatures on the battlefield are going to be non-humans. So you attack with a bunch of non-human humans that Winota put into play earlier. They're all going to trigger Winota, find a bunch more humans. When those humans are on the battlefield, they're not technically humans because of Curse of Conformity, which means they'll trigger Winota. So really cool synergy. Is it necessary to make Winota good? Probably not, but it is a really cool shenanigan with Winota. So Curse of Conformity, play it in decks that might want to put it on yourself, but keep in mind, against tribal decks in specific, can be a good hate card as well. So that was the Selesnya deck, but we also got another one. We got the blue-black zombie deck led by Wilhelt, and again, we're not going to get into Wilhelt. We already talked about him during the first spoiler video, but Wilhelt is all about zombies and decay and sacrifice, and those are the themes that really shine through with the rest of the deck. So let's jump into it, starting with backup commander number 1, Eloise Nephalia Sleuth, and this one's pretty interesting. 5 mana 4/4 legendary human rogue. When another creature you control dies, investigate. You get a clue token, and when you sack a token, you get to surveil one. So surveil when you sack any token, not just the clues, although it is kind of self-contained. A creature dies, you get a clue, you sack the clue, you surveil, maybe do it again and again. So we've seen a lot of cards in the past, the Midnight Reaper style effects, and when a creature dies, you get to draw a card. I believe this is the first one that is a commander that you can play in the command zone, although it is also slow. That is worth pointing out. You don't draw a card when a creature dies. You got to spend 2 mana to sack the clue, although there's some shenanigans to get around that. So Eloise is like inverted Lannis. Lannis makes clues when a creature comes into play. Eloise needs a creature to die. Lannis is a really sweet commander, and I think Eloise can be a sweet one too. I don't think that Eloise, though, is a rogue commander. You see rogue in the creature type, but really, if you want to play rogue tribal, I think you want to play Zaristan. I think you want to play Anawan. Eloise doesn't really do anything specifically with rogues. It's more of a artifact aristocrat token shenanigan style commander, and I think the easiest way to power up Eloise is to have ways to sack your clues that does not involve spending 2 mana for all of them. Sure, sometimes you're going to have the mana and you want to sack them to draw cards, but if you can have things like God Eternal Bond 2, or Reprocess, or even just Syndicate Tracker, sack an artifact, put a counter on it, that's a way that you can sack your clues to surveil with your commander. There are also ways that you can draw cards. Like, imagine casting God Eternal Bond 2 to sack a bunch of creatures and a bunch of clues. You're going to draw a ridiculous number of cards, you're going to surveil a ridiculous number of times, and then whatever creatures you sack are going to give you more clues. You can do the same thing with Reprocess. So there's a lot of sweet aristocrat style shenanigans you can pull off with Eloise. What I want to do with this card, though, by far, is play Nim Tribal. Nim have never actually had a commander, and I think Eloise is the perfect Nim commander. Nim, you might not even remember, they're a creature type from back in original Mirrodin, mostly forgotten, but their gimmick is they get +1/+0 for each artifact you control, and black isn't usually the best color for making a lot of artifacts, but Eloise is a way to do it. You sacrifice a bunch of creatures, make a bunch of artifact, make your Nim really, really huge. So I am ridiculously hyped to build Nim Tribal. It's going to be absolutely horrible, but I am in love with the tribe. I am very nostalgic for original Mirrodin. That's when I started to play. Well, I started to play just after Mirrodin, but those was the first card pool I had. A huge box of like mostly original Mirrodin block stuff. So those are the cards that I remember the most, and Nim are just so weird and goofy. They all have one toughness, but they can get absolutely massive if you have Eloise out to make a bunch of tokens. There's also combos with Eloise. One of the easiest ones is probably March of the Machines. March of the Machines makes each non-creature artifact into an artifact creature with power and toughness equal to its mana cost, which essentially means your clues are going to be 0/0 artifact creatures, and that basically lets you go infinite with death triggers. Essentially, you make a clue, it dies because it's a 0/0, but that triggers Eloise to make another clue, which is going to die because that's a 0/0, and then you're going to make another clue. By itself, I think this just actually draws the game. It just keeps happening again and again and again and again, and you'll investigate forever, and the clues will keep dying. But if you throw a Blood Artist effect, some payoff for having infinite creatures dying, infinite artifacts leaving the battlefield, that can just win you the game on the spot. So that's an easy 2-card combo with one piece out of the command zone, although to actually win the game, you need another piece. Another way to go infinite with it is Time Sieve. Eloise could be a good zombie commander. I'm imagining like Gravecrawler, Phyrexian Altar, and another zombie, and then you can keep casting and sacking the Gravecrawler from your graveyard for just 1 mana, infinite number of times. You don't even actually have to go fully infinite with Phyrexian Altar. You could probably do this combo with just a sacrifice, any sacrifice outlet, and another zombie, because Gravecrawler is 1 mana, so you just make 5 clues, and then you sack the clues to take an extra turn, and then you do that again, and you do that again, and you do that again, and eventually win the game somehow. So I think that's Eloise's role. Eloise is not a rogue commander. It's not even really a zombie commander. It's like combo aristocrat artifact synergy shenanigans, really, really sweet commander. And I gotta say, the commanders in the Selesnya deck are kind of meh, but the commanders in this deck are really sweet. Wilhel is insane, and Eloise is actually pretty insane as well. We also got one more backup commander, Gorex the Tomb Shell. 8 mana, 4/4 zombie turtle. That's right, the first zombie turtle in Magic. As an additional cost to cast it, you can exile any number of creature cards from your graveyard, and it costs 2 less to cast for each card exiled this way. So essentially, you exile 3 creatures, it costs 2 mana, it has Death Touch, and when it attacks or dies, choose a card at random exiled with Gorex, and put that card into its owner's hand. So you get creatures exiled under Gorex, then as you attack with it, or when it dies, you get those cards back, and then theoretically you can use those to fuel Gorex again after they die. So Gorex is interesting. It is slow. It is not a fast card, but I think that's perfectly on flavor for a zombie turtle. Like, it's probably the slowest creature in the multiverse, honestly. Zombies aren't fast, turtles aren't fast. Put them together, this thing is probably just, creeping around incredibly slowly. It reminds me a little bit of Dead Meandering Tower Shell. I don't think it's exactly the same character, but the way they're positioned does look kind of similar. So I don't know, maybe something went wrong with everyone's favorite green slow turtle. As far as actually playing Gorex, it reminds me a little bit of Ethereal Forger, like creature Ethereal Forger. Ethereal Forger broke out in Legacy. You can delve it into play for 2 mana, exiling instant sorcery hopefully from your graveyard, and then when it attacks, you get to return an instant or sorcery that's exiled with it to your hand. Gorex kind of does the same thing, except for creatures, and the returning is random, although you do get the upside of if it dies, you get to get a card back there as well, so it is a steady source of card advantage. I think building around this commander, it's basically graveyard shenanigans. You want the Stitcher suppliers, things to fill your graveyard, specifically creatures to fill your graveyard, to get the cost down on Gorex, and then hopefully like evoke a Shriek Maul and kill something, then exile it with Gorex and get it back, or Sidisi to tutor something up and then get it back with Gorex and do it again. So it's real slow, grindy graveyard value, as opposed to like Hogak, which is super explosive. Gorex is definitely super super fair compared to Gorax, but it does offer more repeatable, slow, late game value. And there's some creatures that are good at getting things in the graveyard. I imagine Violent Tumor, Gravebreaker Lamia, even if you want to go Mono Black Spirits or throw Maskwood Nexus into the mix, maybe a Name Des Aspect to just stock the graveyard and go to town with Gorax. So Gorax, I don't think it's like a super powerful commander, but it's a neat card. Like, it's a zombie turtle, and it does offer a lot of value once it gets going. Just be warned, it's going to be slow, and it's only a 4/4, and it takes a lot of setup, but that's absolutely perfect for a zombie turtle like Gorax. We also got a bunch more zombies, including Cleaver's Cob. So Cleaver's Cob, 4 mana, 2/4. Zombie Horror, pay 3, sack another zombie, make 2 tokens that are copies of the sacrifice creature. This seems like a fun card to use with ETB stuff. ETB zombies, like Grey Merchant of Asphodel. Play it, drain your opponent, sacrifice and get 2 of them, double drain your opponent, Sidisi for 1,000,000 tutors, Lotlith Giant to do a ton of draining from the graveyard. Also worth mentioning, it doesn't say only as a sorcery, so worst case, you just leave up 3 mana and your opponent goes to kill one of your zombies, you sacrifice it and get 2 more to replace it, which offers a lot of value. The other direction to go is Death Trigger, kind of aristocrat zombies, which is perfect for Wilhelt. Wilhelt wants zombies dying, wants creatures dying, and Cleaver's Cob seems perfect for that playstyle. We got like Undead Augur, so you sack the zombie, you draw a card, you get 2 copies of it. You got Relentless Dead, where you're reanimating other zombies. We got zombie blood artists like Diagraph Captain and Plague Belcher, so there's plenty of shenanigans there. I think that Cleaver's Cob probably at its best in a zombie aristocrat style deck, really. I don't think I would just play this in generic zombie tribal, try to beat you down with a bunch of lords. Probably not worth it. It is a 4 mana 2/4, not a lot of stats, but if you're going synergy aristocrat zombies with Wilhelt, or maybe Grimgrin, also like sacking zombies, or the Scarab Gob, like singing in the graveyard, you can sack your stuff to your Cleaver's Cob, get 2 copies, then reanimate the original with Scarab God and go to town that way. Then Cleaver's Cob seems like a really sweet addition, so I like this card. It's just a fun little value-y zombie, but it seems like it can be really powerful in the right deck. Speaking of fun little value-y zombies, we also got Hordewing Scob. So 5 mana 3/3 zombie horror. It has flying. Other zombies you control have flying, and whenever one or more zombies you control deals combat damage to one or more of your opponents, you may draw a card equal to the number of opponents that were dealt damage this way. If you do, discard that many cards. So essentially, Hordewing Scob, 5 mana 3/3, all your zombies have flying, and then if you attack each of your opponents and hit them each with a zombie, you get to triple loot each turn, which is kind of powerful. Zombies like things going in and out of the graveyard. This reminds me a little bit of Archetype of Imagination, might be the easiest comparison. Obviously, your opponent's stuff can still have flying, and it only works with zombies, but in Zombie Tribal, giving your entire board flying, that is a way that you can swing in. Also worth mentioning, works really well with decayed zombies, which is probably part of it. One of the problems with decayed zombies, not only do you only get to attack once, they're only 2/2. So if your opponent has blockers, it's really hard to keep getting in those attacks with them. Well, Hordewing Scob sends them to the air, maybe lets you one-shot kill your opponent with a bunch of undercosted temporary decayed zombies. Also a little Looter Core style action with the looting, or maybe Eldrazi Monument, which might be the worst comparison, because I feel like Hordewing Scob probably worse Eldrazi Monument, especially in a tribe like zombies that can afford to sacrifice decay stuff or whatever. But still, if you're playing Zombie Tribal, especially a graveyardy version of Zombie Tribal, Verena cares about the graveyard, Gisa and Jeroth, maybe Narfi or Sidisi or Madroltha zombies or Cedrus zombies, then I think Hordewing Scob is really good. On the other hand, it is a 5 mana 3/3. Giving your zombies flying is nice. The looting mode is not like super fast. It's not real card advantage, but it certainly goes up in value if you have graveyard shenanigans. So Hordewing Scob, sweet for a graveyard style zombie deck, I think. Otherwise, it's still an interesting card. Next up, we got Shadow Kid, a 4 mana 2/2 shapeshifter, has flash. At the beginning of your upkeep, each player mills 3 cards, and you can exile a creature card from among the cards that were milled this way. If you do, it becomes a copy of that card, except it keeps the ability. So essentially, each turn, you get to mill for 3, and maybe upgrade into a better creature, depending on what you mill. It does only hit the cards that you mill, so you're going to mill a total of 12 cards, and you got to turn into one of those cards. Not a must ability, it is a may ability, so you don't have to, but you're probably going to want to, because there's only a 4 mana 2/2. So Shadow Kid reminds me a little bit of Lazav, kind of Lazav with a lot of drawbacks. Lazav, whenever a creature goes into the graveyard from anywhere, you can turn into a copy of that creature. So you can kill a creature, you can mill it some other way, make your opponent discard it. Shadowkin only turns into things that it mills, which is going to make it pretty inconsistent, I think. Like, there's going to be times when it's insane and you mill the perfect thing and it's huge and it's awesome. On the other hand, there's going to be times when you don't mill much. So I think you need to be a deck that can take advantage of the mill, both the self mill and maybe even milling your opponents. And I think that's where Shadowkin has a shot. If you're playing Madrotha or Scarab God or Garuda and you just want to get stuff in your graveyard, well, this is a fine option. Eventually, you'll hopefully hit something big and turn Shadowkin into it. Plus, worst case, it sits out and mills for 3 each turn to fill your graveyard to support your commander and your other synergies. So Shadowkin, limited in the decks that it can go in, but in the right shell with those graveyard-centric commanders where you just really want your graveyard full, mill for 3 every turn and possibly turn into a big creature eventually seems pretty sweet. We also got Prowling Geistcatcher, and I kind of love this card. 4 mana 2/4 human rogue. When you sacrifice another creature, exile it. If that creature was a token, put a +1/+1 counter on Prowling Geist so you can sack your decayed tokens, blah, 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 blah. When Prowling Geist leaves the battlefield, return each card exiled with it to the battlefield under your control. This is an absurd aristocrat style piece. First, worth pointing out, the way this is worded, it is when you sacrifice another creature, comma, exile it. It's not a replacement effect. This is not a Leyline of the Void. Leyline of the Void is instead. If a creature would go to the graveyard, remove it from the game. Instead, it gets exiled instead. Prowling Geistcatcher is not a replacement effect, which is really important because it means Prowling Geistcatcher does work with aristocrat stuff. You still get your death triggers. If it wasn't worded that way, your Blood Artist wouldn't trigger, your Undead Augur wouldn't trigger. But the way this is worded, your Blood Artist is going to trigger, and the creature you sacrifice is going to go into exile after you get your death triggers, and then eventually Prowling Geistcaster goes away and you get all your stuff back. I also love that it's worded when it leaves the battlefield. There would be a big risk with this sacrifice a bunch of stuff to get it under your Prowling Geistcatcher plan if your opponent could blow you out with Swords to Plowshares or a Cyclonic Rift. But because it says leaves the battlefield, you're pretty safe. If your opponent kills it or bounces it or exiles it, it doesn't really matter. Your stuff is going to be coming back into play, and that is a really powerful effect. There's combo potential here with Karmic Guides and Revel Arcs where you sacrifice your Karmic Guide to get it under Prowling Geistcatcher to your Blasting Station to deal a damage or whatever, and then you sacrifice the Geistcatcher to get back the Karmic Guide, which will get back the Geistcatcher, loop, 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 sack, 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 throw any free sacrifice outlet into the mix, and you basically just win the game on the spot. So that's one powerful thing to do with the card. It also just seems like a sweet value card for sacrifice in aristocrat style decks, where you're able to play Korvold or Tisa Karlov or Yawgmoth, sacrifice your board, and then get all your creatures back to double it up. It makes it like a Rally the Ancestors, essentially, where you're able to play a big board of creatures, sack them all to your Woe Strider, maybe get a Blood Artist out to win the game or something like that, and then Rally the Ancestors essentially gets all those creatures back so you can sack them again, get more Blood Artist triggers. Prowling Geistcatcher does the same thing. You sack your whole board, they're all hidden away under your Geistcatcher, then you sack the Geistcatcher, and then you get them all back and you get to do it again. Plus you got the combo potential we were talking about earlier, which makes it even more insane. So great aristocrat support piece. I think if you're playing an aristocrat style deck or some sort of sacrifice themed deck, probably worth it just because of how much synergy it adds to the deck and how much you can power up your big combo turn. So one of my favorite cards, I think, from the blue-black zombie deck. We also got some pretty flexible zombie removal in Ravenous Rotbelly. So 5 mana 4/5 zombie horror. When it enters the battlefield, you can sacrifice up to 3 zombies. For each one you sacrifice, each opponent sacks that many creatures. So this can range from a 5 mana 4/5, which is pretty bad, up to a Taste of Death. And one of the things I like about it is the flexibility. If your opponent only has one thing on the board that you really want to get rid of, like a hexproof commander, you can just Diabolic Edict, sack 1 zombie. But if you want max value and you need to get rid of multiple things, you can sacrifice 3 zombies and make each opponent sack 3 things. Also stacks up with like Grave Pack style effects, make your opponent sack even more things. And it's well suited for the zombie tribe. Zombies are all about recursion with Grave Crawlers and Relentless Deads and Undying effects and Mikaeses. So even though you technically are sacrificing as many things as your opponent, in a lot of cases you really won't be because you're the zombie deck and you get your stuff back from the graveyard. So Ravenous Rotbelly and Zombie Tribal, I think it's actually a pretty good removal spell. Sacrifice effects, a little bit matchup dependent, bad against tokens, good against big indestructible or hexproof things. But still, if I'm playing Zombie Tribal, at least considering this card in one of my removal slots. We also got Tomb Tyrant, a new zombie lord, 4 mana, 3/3. Other zombies get +1/+1. Pay 3, sack a creature, return a zombie creature card at random from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate this only during your turn and only if there are at least 3 zombie creature cards in your graveyard. So you can't control it. You can't have just one creature and make sure you get the one you want. It is going to be random. So this is kind of like Lord of the Undead, which is a zombie lord that can return zombies to your hand, mixed with Ghoul Raiser, which randomly puts a zombie back to your hand, mixed with Moldgraf Monstrosity, which reanimates 2 random creatures when it dies, all for the zombie tribe. Is this card actually good? I don't know. On one hand, we talked about cheap recursive zombies, like sacking a Gravecrawler, whatever, it's coming back anyway. And then there are a few big zombies, Lalith Trolls and Suitor Ghouls and Bladewing the Risens. So I could see the value being there. Like you just sack a Gravecrawler, recast it anyway, hopefully reanimate something big. And even if you reanimate a random 3-drop Lord or something, that's still fine because you're getting your Gravecrawler back anyway. It also synergizes really well with Decayed. And I think that's the idea of this card. We've talked throughout all of spoiler season about how Decayed creatures are like kind of not real creatures because they only attack once and they're only 2/2s and they can't block and they go away, but they are good synergy pieces. And we have stuff like Wilhelt, we got Jadar, and if you're sacking Decayed tokens that are going to be going to the graveyard anyway, and you can even do this after attacking, you attack and with the sacrifice trigger on the stack, just sacrifice them. Getting back something is better than getting back nothing, although it is very random and hard to control. So Tomb Tyrant, there's a lot of competition in the zombie 4-drop slot. Whether or not it'll actually be good enough, I don't know. But I like the synergy, and it is just a fun, random kind of card to play in your zombie tribal deck. We also got Curse of the Restless Dead, a black curse, 3 mana, curse a player. When a land enters the battlefield under enchanted player's control, you create a 2/2 black zombie creature token with Decayed. So if this card didn't say Decayed, I'd actually be really high on it. As it is with Decayed, it's interesting, but only for a narrow subset of decks. So obviously you want to put this on the green player. Put it on the person that's slinging the Cultivates, the Rampant Groves. At 3 mana, it might be fast enough to get in before most of your opponents ramp, but still, no one's not going to play a land or not ramp with their Cultivate because you have this curse on them. So that means if you curse the green player, you're probably going to make a decent amount of zombies for free throughout the course of the game. The problem is they're Decayed zombies. So if you do play this card, you got to have those sacrifice synergies. Like even in just zombie tribal, I'm not sure it's worth it because Decayed zombies are just pretty useless as creatures. But if you're sacrificing stuff to Plumb the Forbidden or Altar of Dementia or to fuel your Ravenous Rotbelly or trigger your Blood Artist or Corpse Knight or whatever, that's where this card can really shine. So Decayed does keep its power in check and keeps it from being too crazy. But in a deck with a bunch of synergies, aristocrat style synergies, maybe a Wilhelt zombie deck, a Ghoul Color Gisa deck where you can sacrifice the zombies to make more zombies, real zombies that are not decaying, a Grimgrin deck where you need to have this fuel to keep sacrificing to untap your Grimgrin to attack your opponent. That's where Curse of Restless Dead can be really good. So while Decayed does kind of keep the power level of this card down and limit the number of places that will want to play it, like I said, I don't think you play this in just regular zombie tribal. In the right home and in the right meta where you have a green player to put this on, Curse of Restless Dead can do some serious work. We also got Drown in Dreams, a new blue instant. So 2 blue and X for an instant. Target player draws X cards or target player mills twice X cards. And if you get your commander, you get to choose both options. So Drown in Dreams, essentially a Blue Sun Zenith, same scaling, 3 and X. Can also be kind of a pseudo increasing confusion, a big mill spell. I actually think this is a pretty good card. I think Blue Sun Zenith is a card that you can definitely play in commander decks. It's reasonable card draw. And if you're a deck that has graveyard synergies or you're a mill deck, this is probably just an upgrade over Blue Sun Zenith. Sure, you don't get to shuffle it back in, draw it again later, but still, there is a lot of flexibility and upside in Drown in Dreams. So I think mill decks, clearly a better Blue Sun Zenith. If you're playing Marco Voshk or Ambassador Laquatis, Burvac, whatever, Drown in Dreams gonna be a go-to card draw spell because it's a card draw spell that you can actually just mill your opponent a bunch of cards with. If you have 20 mana available in the late game because you're pulling off your whatever Cabal Coffer shenanigans, this is going to get a lot of cards out of an opponent's deck. Mill twice X is a lot of cards being milled, so it can be a finisher there. And worst case, in the early game, you just draw some cards and refill your hand. Also works really well if you go Sphinx's Tutelage to Fairy Tutelage style mill, where you're getting the card draw, which you want anyway, and that's triggering your tutelages to mill a bunch of cards, and then you also get to mill your opponent a bunch with Drowning Dreams if you have your commander out. Also interesting in decks that want to fill their own graveyard. In a deck like Madrotha or Kaz or Slogurk the Overslime, one of our new additions from Innistrad Midnight Hunt, I imagine you play this to target yourself, with the idea being, I get to draw some cards, and I get to fill my graveyard, and then that's going to grow my Slogurk, or fuel my Kaz, or my Madrotha. So Drowning Dreams, not ground shattering, it seems like every other set now, we get some Blue Sun Zenith variant, but this is a good one if you're a deck that either cares about filling your own graveyard, or cares about milling your opponent out. We also got Ghoul's Night Out, 5 mana sorcery. For each player, choose a creature card in that player's graveyard. Put those cards onto the battlefield under your control. They're black zombies in addition to their other colors and types, and they gain Decayed. So on one hand, this is a really aggressively costed reanimation spell. 5 mana, reanimate 4 creatures. We've seen like Ever After be semi-playable. 6 mana, reanimate 2 creatures. Ghoul's Night Out is almost 4 reanimates stapled together. Like if you cast reanimate 4 times, it'd be 4 mana. You're paying 1 extra mana for Ghoul's Night Out, and you're not losing any life. That's insane. Like that is incredibly powerful. However, the creatures you're getting have Decayed. This is something we've been discussing with like Gisa Glorious Resurrector. Same problem. You can get a bunch of stuff at a really good rate, but they can't block. They can only attack once. Is that going to be worth it? And I think with Ghoul's Night Out, the answer is yes, because there's some shenanigans to take advantage of it. The easiest is just go after value creatures. Like, who cares if your Muldrifter has Decayed? Who cares if the Eternal Witness you steal has Decayed? Their job is their Enter the Battlefield trigger. So I think that's the easiest way to take advantage of this. Just get creatures that aren't really about attacking and blocking. They're about their Enter the Battlefield triggers. So I imagine playing this in like Yarok or Panharmonicon, play a few of the new, symmetrical mill synergies to get everyone's graveyard full, and then just get a bunch of things with Enter the Battlefield triggers. There are other ways to go about it that are jankier and take a lot of work, but there's a few cards that can turn decay creatures into real creatures, like Conjurer's Closet, for example. Exiles a creature on your end step, and then it returns to the battlefield under your control. So even though you don't own the creatures from Ghoul's Night Out, you're still going to be able to blink them and get them back under your controller. Same with Cold Storage. Cold Storage, a lot slower. 3 mana, put a creature you control on Cold Storage. Love the wording on that. And then you sacrifice it to get all those creatures back. So these are ways that you can steal creatures with Ghoul's Night Out. Same with Thassa Deep Dwelling if you're in blue. You can steal creatures with Ghoul's Night Out and then turn them into real creatures that can attack and block and do all the creaturey stuff. So I like this card. There's enough value-y creatures to reanimate that I think this is probably good just in a random meta, in a random deck. And if you want to build around it because you're playing Decayed stuff, other Decayed cards, there are ways that you can turn the Decayed creatures into real creatures. Finally today, we got another 3 mana colored mana rock. Crowded Crypt, 3 mana artifact, adds a black mana. When a creature you control dies, put a corpse counter on it. Then you can pay 6, sack it, and make a 2/2 decay zombie for each corpse counter on Crowded Crypt. And this is essentially a manalith for a black deck. It's a 3 mana rock, not exciting, but there is a lot of upside here. The upside is eventually making a big board, and as we've talked about with some other cards, this is an aristocrat style card. I think you want to play this, use it like a mana rock. As the game goes along, stuff is dying, you're sacrificing creatures to Yawgmoth or Korvold or Exodus, and then eventually this is just going to make a huge board full of zombies. You're going to make 10 decay zombies, and sure, the decayed zombies aren't that good, but you're a sacrifice deck, so that's 10 more things you can sacrifice to Yawgmoth or Korvold. That's a ton of draining with a Yara. It's shenanigans with Savra, removal with Tisa, Sir Conrad, having them go to the graveyard and drain your opponent out of the game. So this is a synergy piece. I wouldn't play this in just a random black deck. It's a 3 mana rock. That's not that exciting, but if you're trying to sacrifice things for value, this is a great way to play a okay mana rock that also is going to give you a ton of value as the game goes long, as you essentially are able to double up up all of your death triggers with a 2/2 decay zombie. Costs 6 mana, but still, that's a lot of value for the late game. So just let it store up, and then eventually have this big turn where you combo off and win the game. Also, synergizes really well with Prowling Geist Catcher. That might be my favorite synergy. And this is even in the Commander Precon, where you can have creatures die, and they get exiled to your Prowling Geist Catcher, and then eventually you sack the Geist Catcher and get back all the creatures, and as all those creatures are dying, they're also putting counters on your Crowded Crypt, so then you can also spend 6 mana and get a bunch of decay zombies, and then have the big combo turn where you sacrifice everything, drain your opponent out of the game with Blood Artist, or however you're finishing the game. So I think that Crowded Crypt in the right deck, in the Aristocrat style deck, or a Decayed Shell, is going to be a really, really strong option. Otherwise, that's just a 3 mana rock. And that, oh my goodness, brings us to the end of our daily Innistrad Midnight Hunt Commander spoilers for today. So what do you think of these decks? You can see the full deck list, again, as a reminder, over on mtgpreviews.com. So check that out if you want to see the full deck list. Also over on the Goldfish site with prices and all that, mtggoldfish.com. But what do you think? What are you hyped for? Which deck do you like better? What card are you most excited to use to upgrade into another deck? Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I will talk to you soon.
Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.